Now that I have your attention, what's shaking, BookTube? Excited about today's video? Yeah, she's excited. Today I want to tell you about an author that is making me say, Stephen King who? Is that an exaggeration? Yes. But I have been on a bit of a binge lately of a particular author that you may already know who this is if you follow me on Goodreads, but I think it's about time I officially talk to you about it. Roll the intro. So today I want to talk about a few books I've read by my new favorite author of recent, and I'm also going to tell you about a Stephen King short story that I've reread recently. And going back and reading it again, it's a bit different than how I remember. But I'm going to save that for last because there's a few spoilers with that one. Anyway, the author in question is Stephen King's own flesh and blood, Joe Hill. Another author in the league of authors with questionable haircuts. Can we just take a moment to appreciate just how great the King family author photos truly are? Superb. The first book I actually read by Joe Hill was Horns, because I loved the movie and I was like, you know what, I might check out the book. And at that point, I didn't even know Joe Hill was Stephen King's son. But I read it, I loved it, and I've got a whole other review on that, but to be fair, that's from a long time ago. I don't want to talk about Horns today, I want to talk about another book I read by Joe Hill that really made me fall in love with his writing. And that book is Heart-Shaped Box. Yes, I have been talking about this book a lot on this channel, but I haven't actually done a proper video on it. And this isn't the only Joe Hill book I want to talk about today. I also want to tell you about his collection of short stories, Strange Weather, because I listened to that recently as well, by audiobook. Anyway, Heart-Shaped Box is a bit of a shift from the conventional haunting story. This one was unique, and when it was pitched to me, when someone told me I should read this and they told me what it's about, I'll admit I was a bit skeptical. The first major difference is that it doesn't focus around a young person. It doesn't even focus around a middle-aged person. It focuses on someone who is getting on in years. Now granted, they are still physically fit and still quite strong, but the character, Judas Coyne, he is described as being an elderly kind of man. He's got greying hair, he is getting a bit on in age. Basically, Judas Coyne is a retired rock star. He used to be in the heavy metal scene, I guess you could say, heavy rock scene, and he's still quite wealthy and he's a collector of cultist items. One day his assistant tells him about a haunted suit that belongs to a dead man, and naturally he's like, fuck it, yeah, I want that. How every great haunting starts. Someone saying, fuck it. So he gets the suit and naturally chaos ensues. I won't tell you too much more about the plot other than there's a fantastic side character called Mary Beth, who is one of the best romantic interests I've ever read about because she has an importance to the story that is more than just being motivation for the main character to stay alive, and I think that's fantastic. She is a good character in her own right. But the fantastic thing about this book, the best thing I think, is that it doesn't rely on cheap jump scares or predictable elements of conventional horror haunting stories. One thing I've noticed with Joe Hill is he sets the mood first and then he tries to scare you. Anyway, I gave that book 5 stars. I highly recommend it if you're into scary stories and you do want to read something that is a bit different from the norm. If you do want to take a risk and jump outside the box, read something a bit different, I would highly recommend this one. Another great thing about Heart-Shaped Box is that it's not so much a twist, but there is elements to this that is more than just being a haunting. There is an actual plot line. There's a reason for what's happening to be happening. I listened to a bit of that one on audiobook as well, narrated by Stephen Lang, who I just have to say, after listening to a few collaborations between Stephen Lang and Joe Hill, those two are a match made in heaven. That brings me on to the next one, and that is Strange Weather. It's a collection of 4 short stories that can be classified as novellas, I believe. Basically, they are stories with the central theme being weather.
That's weird.
But the weather doesn't always play an important part. I mean, the weather ranges from being just nothing more than a background setting to the story. No real importance, just there to, I suppose, link it. ranges right up to being pretty much the story, the main antagonist, the main driving force. So the first one is Snapshot, and that is about a young man who comes across a traveler who has a mystery about him that turns out to be quite dangerous, and there isn't really anything else I can say without spoiling it. That was part of the problem with this story. It was very, very predictable. I think within the first couple of pages I predicted what the main thing was. That one was just okay. So after that you have Loaded, and this was the biggest and the most fantastic of all four short stories. There was obviously a very strong political message in this one. It is about guns and gun control, I guess, although not so much. You could approach Loaded as someone who is either pro or anti-gun control, and you could still take away a different message from the story, because there's a lot there. Essentially, the story Loaded focuses around a few different individuals whose stories end up becoming intertwined around the subject of mass shootings. It was actually... See, reading this was a bit weird, because the story's set in Florida, and literally while I was reading this, the Florida shootings happened. It did make it a bit difficult to finish the story, but then in another way, it gave the story even more importance. I don't know, this is the story out of the four that have really stuck with me, and it left a feeling with me. I'm not too sure what that feeling is. I wouldn't suggest approaching this short story if you're prone to melancholy, but if you're reading Joe Hill, wouldn't seem likely that you are. Or if you are, I guess you enjoy it. After Loaded was some much needed reprieve, and that was Aloft. Aloft was probably the funnest, and it still did have a bit of a dark, intriguing kind of underlying plot there, but for the most part it was just fun wondering how he would get out of the situation, what would happen next. Basically, Aloft is about a young man who goes skydiving, he's terrified, and he ends up being stuck on a sentient cloud. He ends up on this cloud with absolutely no way down. He doesn't have a parachute anymore, and the cloud seems to form itself into whatever he's thinking, as if the cloud wants him to stay there. But obviously having no food would be a bit of an issue. I honestly really did love this story. It was the second favorite out of the four, and I don't know, it was just interesting and so unique. Although if I was to point out one flaw, it's that it felt like, and again, I'm trying not to spoil anything, but it felt like where it ended needed to be filled in a bit more. I want to know what the thing was. It felt like there was purpose that needed to be explained there that kind of wasn't. So then there was, I think it's just called Rain, and it was my least favorite of the four, just because this one really didn't have any kind of major complexity or driving force for me, at least. It's basically about, it just starts raining shards of crystal, and obviously this is devastating, a lot of people die. And the story was the main character trying to go on a bit of a journey to tell her spouse's father that the spouse in question had died in the downpour. And honestly, I became a bit bored at a certain point. I was just waiting for the next rain to come down so there could be some excitement. And I predicted what would be at the end of the journey very early on, so that kind of ruined it as well. At the end, there was a bit of a twist, I guess you could say, that kind of saved it, but then at the same time, the twist itself felt kind of shoehorned. It didn't feel like there was any clues to this being the case to begin with, and it felt like it was only put in there to give some last-minute conflict. But yeah, anyway, that was Strange Weather, and I only really enjoyed two of those stories, and that's Loaded and Aloft, and which are completely different stories, mind you. The other two didn't really leave any kind of effect on me whatsoever, but I did love it. So I ended up giving the story 4 stars. So yeah, that's Joe Hill. He's my new favorite author, and I'm definitely going to be reading on with more Joe Hill going forward. I think the next one I'm going to read is The Fireman. Joe Hill has this kind of atmosphere where the storytelling feels like he's sitting you down, handing you a glass of beer and saying, "Boy, do I have a fucking story for you." And then he tells you the story, like you're sitting there with him, rather than someone writing it down and then passing it to you. And the reason I say Stephen King who is because I think I like Joe Hill more than anything I've ever read by Stephen King. I don't know, maybe that's just an unpopular opinion. Last but not least, I reread 1408, or Room 1408 by Stephen King, and I'll just say this, just very quickly. and I guess slight spoiler alert for the movie, the story was a lot more anticlimactic than I remembered. I mean, it sets this really kind of sinister tone, especially with the way it cuts back and forth in time, referring only to the tape recorder. But there is a lot there that the movie kind of filled in. Obviously, as a movie, and this was a short story, it's very, very short. The movie needed to drag it over an hour and a half to 2 hours. So they added a lot of their own stuff in. More specifically, the element in the movie where the hour, is it an hour? I don't know, but the time repeats itself. Every time he makes it to the end, it starts again. That was the scariest part, I feel, of the movie. That's what really made it a psychological thriller. The feeling that there is absolutely no way out, and even if you make it to the end, you're just gonna go back again. And then he does make it out, and then the world crumbles around him and he's back in the room. And then at the end of the movie, depending on which version you watched, he kinda does make it out. Either that or he burns to death. The short story was just a lot less scary than I remember it being. Not a whole lot there happens, and the haunting of the hotel room itself happens in a very, very short space. Here's something about the short story, and I'm not sure if I enjoyed this or didn't, but it really extends on the interaction between Michael Ensslin, who is the author who goes into the haunted hotel room, and the owner of the Dolphin Hotel. I think the short story was more about the hotel owner trying to convince him not to do it, and him saying, you know what bro, I'm gonna fucking do it anyway. Fuck out of my way. And that interaction is fantastic, but the haunting really is the appeal of the story. And I get it, a short story is a short story, but I don't know. This isn't me saying I don't like the short story. This is just me comparing it to my earlier reading of it, and I just remember it being better. I think this is one of those situations where I really do prefer the movie to the story. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. If you want to, do the thing, follow me on the thing, and I will see you in the next video. Catch ya.